The signal came in on a Tuesday, and Tuesdays never handed you anything you actually wanted. I was 3 hours into a cracked exhaust manifold on a Valoran cargo hauler, flat on my back beneath the machine, breathing in scorched hydraulic fluid and a faint organic smell I'd made the deliberate choice not to identify. The bay was quiet, just the slow drip of a coolant line I'd been promising to fix for 6 weeks, and the low hum of the portable scanner clipped to my belt. That scanner was older than my ship. I'd bought it at a parts auction on the Keith Drift for 11 credits because the previous owner had scratched the casing and decided it was junk. He was wrong about that, and I knew it the second I powered it on. It beeped once, a single short tone. I almost let it go. Single tones usually meant a background radiation spike, and background radiation spikes meant nothing. But it beeped again, and again. Then it locked into one long, unbroken note that slid me out from under the hauler with grease across my forehead and honest confusion on my face. The display read one thing, Omeganol. I sat and stared at it. Every species in the galaxy had agreed 3 centuries back that the Omeganol band was dead air. It was a frequency so old, so far below the range of anything modern, that broadcasting on it was the technological equivalent of shouting into a sealed vault. Nobody monitored it. Nobody transmitted on it. It was a relic from before the Galactic Conclave ever standardized communications, and the only reason it still had a name was that galactic communications law required every dead band to be cataloged and kept on file. My scanner was ancient enough to still hear it. That was the entire reason I heard it too. I set down my wrench and walked to the comms console at the front of the bay, pulled the raw feed, listened. Not static, not noise. A pattern repeating on a 40-second loop, riding a carrier wave that had no business existing, wrapped in a signal code I'd never seen. Long, layered, nothing like any distress format in my library, but you didn't need a translation to feel the shape of it. This wasn't an automated beacon. It wasn't a location ping. It was a message, composed, deliberate, aimed at a specific audience. The last 3 symbols in the loop formed a question. I ran them through my translation matrix 3 times because I was sure I'd misread. I hadn't. Stripped of its ancient formatting and rendered into plain speech, the question was this: is there a human receiving this signal? I leaned back and looked at those words for a long while. My name is Calvin Mercer, 34, born in a mid-sized city in northern England nobody off Earth has ever heard of, and I've spent 11 years as an independent deep space mechanic. My ship, the Narrow Gate, is a modified Haranasi utility vessel I've rebuilt so many times. It shares almost nothing with the original except the registration number and one stubborn bolt in the engine housing I've tried and failed to remove 17 times. I work out of the Keith Drift, which is the galaxy's polite phrase for a debris belt so choked with abandoned tech and salvage crews that the Conclave Mapping Authority gave up charting it and issued a hazard advisory instead. The Drift is where ships go to die. It's also where people like me make a living. I wasn't famous. I wasn't exceptional by any measure the galaxy cared about. I was human, tolerated in most commercial ports, mocked in a few, and consistently underestimated by species who'd been crossing the stars for millennia before humanity worked out atmospheric flight. The galactic community had a word for us that translated roughly as tinkers. It wasn't a compliment. It meant useful the way a basic tool is useful, decent with our hands, nothing sophisticated. I'd heard the word aimed at me more times than I could count, and I'd learned to let it slide by without a reaction. Because the best way to prove an opinion wrong is to be too busy working to argue about it. I traced the signal for 2 hours. It wasn't easy. Omeganol was never built for precise location tracking, and whatever was broadcasting had been at it long enough that the signal had scattered across a wide arc of the drift. But I had a good scanner, a better-than-average antenna array I'd built from salvage, and the particular patience that only comes from years spent on problems that refuse to cooperate. The source was deep in the interior, past the zone where most salvagers worked, past the navigational markers, into the section the conclave charts labeled hazardous density and otherwise left blank. Ships didn't go in there without a good reason. The debris was too thick, the gravity micropockets too unpredictable, and whatever you dug out rarely justified the trip. I filed a course plot, locked the narrow gate's nav to a careful threading route, and ate a cold meal while she worked through the first 2 hours of the crossing. I sat in the pilot's seat and thought about the question someone had been broadcasting into dead space. Is there a human receiving this signal? Not a ship, not a crew, not a rescue team, a human, specifically, personally. A single biological member of a species the galaxy considered marginally useful for fixing broken things. The debris thickened as I pushed deeper. Forward lights on full, collision sensors sweeping every 15 seconds. The narrow gate handled tight spaces better than anything twice her size, because I'd spent 3 years rebuilding her maneuvering systems from the ground up. She was slow in a straight run and precise in close quarters, and close quarters were where I lived. I almost missed it. The ship was dark. That was the problem. No active signals, no running lights, no nav beacon, no transponder, nothing a modern detection rig would look for. The only thing it broadcast was the omega null signal, and the only reason I found it was that the signal strengthened as I closed in, giving me a bearing to follow. When my forward lights finally caught the hull, I brought the narrow gate to a full stop and sat very still. The ship in front of me was enormous. I'd seen big vessels, conclave dreadnoughts, heavy freighters, colonial transports built to carry 300,000 and house them for half a year. Large wasn't a foreign concept. But this was something else. This was a scale that felt wrong in the way only truly ancient things feel wrong, because the age of it was written into every line. The proportions were off by modern standards. The hull curves were too smooth, too deliberate, shaped by a design philosophy that shared nothing with anything built in the last 5 centuries. I recognized it immediately. Not because I'd ever seen one in person, but because every mechanic who spends time in the drift eventually learns to identify Keth architecture on site. You learn it the way you learn to spot a specific electrical hazard or an old valve's pressure rating. So you know exactly what you're looking at, and can make an informed choice about whether to get any closer. The Keth were dead. Their civilization had collapsed 800 years ago under circumstances the galactic historical record described in language so carefully neutral you could tell it was hiding something painful. Their technology was prohibited under a treaty signed by 32 species. A treaty with one primary rule. You did not touch Keth ships, Keth stations, Keth construction of any kind, and you absolutely did not restore any of it to operational status. I had a deep and thorough respect for galactic law. I also had 11 years of looking at broken things and feeling a very specific discomfort that didn't fade until I fixed them. The ship filled my entire view screen. Even from 100 meters out, I could read the damage. Hull plates bent inward at the midsection, a collision with something massive, decades or centuries back, scoring along the forward sections that might have been weapons fire or debris impact. A long tear down the port side, partially sealed from the inside. A repair done by someone working in desperate conditions a very long time ago. My scanner was going wild, not with danger alerts, with readings. The power signature deep in the ship's interior was so faint it barely registered, but it was there, steady, and doing something no genuinely dead ship would ever do. It was fluctuating in sync with the omega null broadcast. Something in there was spending what little power it had left to keep that signal alive, and it had been doing it for a very, very long time. I keyed my comm array to the omega null band, which took 4 minutes of manual configuration because my standard system didn't support it, and I had to root through the old secondary array I kept for exactly this kind of situation. Then I spoke. "This is Calvin Mercer aboard the narrow gate. I'm human. I'm receiving your signal. Do you copy?" The reply came in 11 seconds, which meant whatever was on the other end had been waiting and had answered the instant it heard me. The voice was not what I expected. I'd braced for an automated system, an emergency AI on backup power, the dry, functional response of a beacon's onboard computer. What I got took a moment to process. The voice was female. Synthesized but layered in a way that felt genuinely old, carrying harmonics no modern architecture produced, and it spoke galactic standard that was slightly off in ways I couldn't immediately name. The grammar was right, the vocabulary was right, but the rhythm was wrong. The emphasis fell in strange places. The pauses between clauses landed like a recording from an entirely different era. Signal confirmed, organic life confirmed, species signature matches the biological profile in my records. You are human. "That's correct," I said. A pause, almost 3 full seconds. "I have been broadcasting on this frequency for 412 years, the voice said. "You are the first to respond." I didn't know what to say to that, so for a while I said nothing. I looked at the dark hull filling my screen, the tear in the port side, the bent plates, the old scoring. I thought about a voice talking into silence for 4 centuries. "Why humans specifically?" I asked. "Because my crew is gone," the voice said, "and I am broken in ways that require particular skills. My records on sapient species indicate humans have an unusual relationship with mechanical systems, that you repair things not only out of need, but for a reason I have had difficulty categorizing." "What reason?" Another pause. "Because you cannot tolerate something being broken when you could fix it. The distinction appears important. Other species repair things when it is practical. Humans repair things when it is simply wrong for something to remain broken. I needed the second kind." I looked at the dead hull for a long moment. "What's your name?" I asked. "My designation is ISV Keth Moral," the voice said. "I am the last operational warship of the Keth civilization, a beat. Operational is perhaps not the correct word. I am the last surviving warship of the Keth civilization. I have been surviving for 800 years. "I'm going to need to board you," I said. "I was hoping you would say that." And something in the way she shaped those words, something underneath the tone, made me sit back and understand fully that I was not talking to an automated system. I was talking to something that had been alone for a very long time. Something that had spent 4 centuries hoping someone would answer, and had just heard a voice come back. I started prepping my boarding kit. It took me 20 minutes to gather what I'd need for a first assessment of an unknown vessel in unknown condition, running on power so low the interior was almost certainly dark and cold. Suit, helmet, independent oxygen, first-pass tools, diagnostics, a portable power cell, a light rig, my primary scanner. I packed a secondary toolkit and 2 emergency hull patches too, because I'd boarded enough damaged ships to know the plan changes the second you're inside one. I kept the channel open while I worked. "Tell me the condition of your main systems," I said. "I can tell you what I know," the voice said, "which is less than I would like. My sensory capacity is limited by available power. I run on 2 backup crystal cores that have been degrading for roughly 6 centuries. I have partial access to internal sensors covering approximately 30% of my interior volume. Life support in that region is marginal. Temperature is 11 degrees above the absolute minimum for carbon-based life. Atmospheric composition is within survivable range, but I would recommend supplemental oxygen. Noted structural integrity. The primary frame is intact. Keth alloy does not degrade under normal conditions, and these conditions, while not normal, have not compromised the structural lattice. The outer hull has sustained significant damage in sections 7, 9, and 14. Section 9 has been sealed from the interior, as I mentioned. Sections 7 and 14 are exposed to vacuum. A pause. I sealed Section 9 myself over a period of 17 years, working with the minimal robotic systems I had available. It was slow work. I stopped what I was doing. 17 years of slow work, alone, patching a hole in your own hull with equipment that barely functioned. I filed that next to the 4 centuries of broadcasting into silence, and decided that whatever I was about to find inside this ship, nothing about it was going to be simple. "I'm going to dock at your starboard airlock," I said, "assuming you still have one." Starboard secondary airlock is intact and functional. I have redirected the remaining power from 3 non-essential systems to operate the mechanism. You will have manual access. The light inside the docking corridor is minimal, but present. "How much power did that cost you?" A pause. "Enough that I will need to reduce transmission power on this signal after you board. But you will be inside by then, so the calculation is acceptable." I picked up my helmet, checked the seal, set it down for a moment. "You've been planning this," I said, "for a while." "For 412 years, the voice agreed. "I have had time to plan." I pulled the helmet on and locked it, checked my suit pressure, picked up my tool bag and walked to the narrow gate's airlock. Through the small porthole in the outer door, I could see the dark flank of the Kethmoral filling the view, enormous, quiet and waiting. "One question before I come over," I said. "Yes." "Why did you stop asking for the Keth? Why switch to asking for humans?" The longest pause yet, long enough that I thought the signal had dropped. Then the voice came back, quieter somehow, carrying something I couldn't name. "Because the Keth are gone," it said. "They have been gone for 800 years, and I needed someone who understood what it was to look at something broken and feel that it was wrong for it to stay that way. My records suggested humans were the best candidates for that particular feeling." Another pause. "Also, because you are the only species in the current galactic community who still answers signals on frequencies everyone else has forgotten." I cycled the airlock and stepped out into the darkness between the 2 ships. "That sounds about right," I said. The space between the 2 ships was black in a way that open space rarely is. Out past the drift you at least had the light of distant stars to give the void some texture. In here, wedged deep in the hazardous density zone with debris blocking every angle, there was nothing. Just my suit lamp throwing a narrow cone across the Kethmoral's hull as I crossed the gap on a tether line. Up close, the ship stopped being a shape on a view screen and became a wall. A curved metal cliff face stretching up and down and sideways past the reach of my light. I put a gloved hand on it as I approached the airlock, and even through the suit I could feel that it was cold. A deep, settled cold that had nothing left to give. "I'm at the starboard airlock," I said. "I see you. Sensor coverage in this section is functional." A pause. "It has been a very long time since my sensors registered something moving under its own power against my hull." The airlock was a recessed hexagon set into the plating, its edges worn smooth. As I watched, a seam of pale light traced the outline, and the outer door drew back into the hull with a grinding slowness that told me exactly how much the mechanism was struggling. "That took more out of me than I estimated," the voice said. "The bearings have not been serviced in 800 years. You will find that is a recurring theme." "I imagine I will," I said and stepped inside. The chamber cycled. It was slow, the pumps working at maybe a tenth of the pace they'd have run at full power, and I stood in the narrow space watching a status panel I couldn't read count through symbols in the Keth script. When the inner door finally opened, it opened onto darkness. My lamp caught the corridor beyond in pieces. High ceilings, higher than any modern ship bothered with. Walls of that same smooth alloy, ribbed at intervals with structural supports shaped like nothing I'd ever built around. And everywhere, a thin film of frost, the kind that forms over centuries when the last of the moisture in the air gives up and settles. Atmosphere reads survivable, I said, checking my suit display. Cold, thin, but survivable. I'm keeping the helmet on anyway. A wise choice. My life support is not something I would stake a stranger's lungs on. I moved down the corridor. My footsteps were the only sound, magnetic soles clicking against a deck that had held no weight in 8 centuries. Doorways opened off the passage at intervals, most of them sealed, a few standing open onto rooms my light couldn't fully reach. I passed something that might have been a common area, long benches built into the walls, and I didn't look at it too closely, because I already knew what I was going to be thinking about if I did. The crew. Where do you want me? I asked. Continue forward. There is a junction ahead. Take the left branch and descend 2 levels. The core chamber is there. It is where I am in the sense that I am anywhere. A pause. It is also where the damage matters most. I followed the route. The left branch narrowed and sloped downward, and I found the descent by the presence of a ladder shaft. No artificial gravity plating working down here, so I clipped my line and climbed, my lamp swinging shadows across walls that closed in tighter with every level. The core chamber, when I reached it, was the first place aboard that had any light of its own. It wasn't much. A dim amber glow from 2 crystalline columns set into a housing at the center of the room, each of them taller than I was, each of them webbed with fractures that caught the light and scattered it. The glow pulsed faint, uneven, fading almost to nothing and then recovering. I recognized the rhythm before my scanner confirmed it. It was the Omeganol broadcast, the pulse of the signal she'd been sending for 400 years, made visible in the flicker of 2 dying cores. These are your crystal cores, I said. Yes, what remains of my primary power architecture. There were originally 16. These 2 are the last that hold any charge, and they hold very little. The broadcast draws from them directly. Everything I have done for the last 6 centuries, the sensors, the airlock, the 17 years of hull repair, this conversation has come from these 2. I knelt in front of the housing and got my scanner in close. The readings were bad in the way that broken things are bad when they're also the only thing keeping the patient alive. The cores were degrading, had been degrading for longer than any human civilization had existed, and there was no reversing that. But degradation and failure aren't the same thing. Degradation you can slow. You can manage. You can nurse a dying system along if you understand what's killing it. The fractures are the problem, I said. You're bleeding charge through the cracks faster than the cores can hold it. Every pulse you send costs you more than it should because half the energy's dissipating before it does any work. That is consistent with my own diagnostics. I lack the means to address it. I don't. I sat back on my heels. Not fully. I can't repair a Keth crystal core. Nobody alive can. The technology's a treaty violation and I wouldn't know where to start. But I can seal the fractures. Not perfectly. Enough to cut the losses. Enough that every pulse you send actually costs you what it should instead of double. A pause, longer than her processing delays. You would do that? It wasn't quite a question. That's why you called for a human, I said, isn't it? Yes, a pause. I have run the projection 9,000 times over 4 centuries. In every version, a human arrives, assesses the cores, and either declines because the work violates their laws, or agrees because the broken thing in front of them matters more than the law. I did not know which version I would get. I calculated the probabilities. I did not calculate how it would feel to watch you kneel down and simply begin. I was already unpacking my kit. I haven't begun yet, I said. I'm going to need to understand what I'm working with first. Tell me about the fractures, all of them. Where, how deep, how old? I pulled out my sealant rig and my fine work tools and laid them out on a cloth against the frost. And while I work, you're going to tell me what happened to your crew. Because I'm about to spend a lot of hours in here with you, and I'd rather know whose ship I'm standing in. The silence stretched so long that I looked up from my tools. The amber glow of the cores pulsed once, twice. That is a longer story than the repair, the voice said finally. I've got time, I said. More than you've had company, start wherever you want. And after a moment she did. 800 years ago, she said, the Keth were not a dead civilization. We were a frightened one. And the difference between those two things is the whole of the story. I found the first fracture while she was deciding where to begin. It ran diagonally across the base of the left core, hairline thin at the top and widening as it descended. And when I brought my light close, I could see the faint amber leak of charge escaping through it like heat off a road. I set my sealant rig to its lowest output, because Keth crystal was nothing I understood, and the last thing a dying core needed was an aggressive hand, and I laid the first bead of sealant along the top of the crack. You can talk while I work, I said. It helps me, and it's been a while since you had anyone to talk to. 412 years, she said, but who is counting? I almost laughed. 800 years alone, and the ship had developed something that was very close to a sense of humor. I filed that away too, alongside everything else I was filing. The Keth, she said, were a cautious people. This is the part the galactic historical record does not explain because the record was written by species who came after us and they mistook caution for arrogance. We were not arrogant. We were afraid. We had good reason to be. The sealant caught against the crystal and held. I watched the amber leak thin, then stop, along the top 3 centimeters of the fracture. A small thing, the first of many. Afraid of what? I asked. Ourselves at first, then everything else. A pause. We were the oldest spacefaring civilization in this region of the galaxy. When we crossed the stars, there was no one to greet us. No conclave, no treaties, no neighbors. We were alone, and we were powerful, and being alone with power for a long time does something to a people. We built weapons because there was nothing to stop us. We built ships like this one, warships, to defend against threats that did not yet exist. We prepared for an enemy for so long that, when the galaxy finally began to fill with other voices, we could no longer hear them as anything but the enemy we had been waiting for. I moved down the fracture, laying the next bead. The work was slow and it needed to be slow. A minute per centimeter, checking after each pass that the crystal wasn't rejecting the seal, that I wasn't trapping stress in the lattice that would crack it worse. So you went to war, I said. We almost did. That is the part I have had 800 years to think about, the almost. When the other species came, my crew wanted to strike first. Not out of cruelty. Out of the old fear, worn so deep into us that it felt like wisdom. And this ship was built to be the instrument of that first strike. A warship at the front of a fleet, carrying the authority to begin something that could not be undone. The glow of the core pulsed against my hands. I'd sealed maybe a fifth of the fracture now. The leak was measurably thinner. But you didn't, I said, strike first. No, we did not. Her voice did something then that I hadn't heard from it yet. It slowed and softened and carried a weight that no synthesized system produces by accident. My captain refused the order. Her name was Vesh Torin. She was the commander of this vessel and the senior officer of the forward fleet, and when the fleet command transmitted the order to open fire on the approaching ships, she did not relay it. She held her position. She opened a channel to the other species instead of a weapons port. And she said, I have this recorded. I have replayed it more times than any other file in my memory, she said. We have been alone and afraid for 10,000 years. I would rather be wrong about them than right about us. I stopped working. I sat there in the cold with the sealant rig in my hand and the amber light on my face, and I let that sentence settle into me, the way she'd clearly let it settle into herself across 8 centuries. I would rather be wrong about them than right about us. What happened to her? I asked. She was removed from command for it. The fleet did not fire, her refusal broke the moment, and the moment did not come back, and the war that would have defined this region of the galaxy simply did not happen. The species she spared went on to found the conclave that governs the galaxy today. They do not know her name. It is not in their record. The record says the Keth chose peace, as though it were a decision made by a whole people, and not by one commander standing against her own orders and her own fear. A pause. But she paid for it. Her people did not forgive her for being right. And the Keth, having turned away from the war they were built for, found they did not know what they were for anymore. A civilization organized entirely around a fear it has just renounced does not survive the loss of that fear intact. We came apart. Slowly. Over generations. Not in a war, we never had our war, but in the silence that came after we decided not to have it. I looked at the 2 dying cores. That's the collapse, I said. The one the record hides. You didn't lose a war. You lost the reason you'd built yourselves around, and there was nothing underneath it. Yes, quietly. The historians who came after could not understand it, so they wrote it neutrally, and neutrality made it sound like a mystery. It was not a mystery. It was grief. We grieved ourselves out of existence over 400 years. And this ship, the warship that did not fire, was decommissioned, stripped, and eventually abandoned out here in the debris, because no one could stand to look at the thing that had been built to start the war we were ashamed of not having. I set down my tools. And you kept her order, I said. Vesh Torrens, you've been holding on to it this whole time. I am the only thing left that remembers her correctly, the Keth Moral said. Every other record renders her a footnote or erases her entirely, but I was there. I heard her voice when she made the choice. I have carried the truth of it for 800 years, and I have had no one to tell, because the frequency everyone still listens to has no room for a story this old. A pause. That is the other reason I called for a human. Your species is young enough to still believe that one person refusing an order can change the shape of history. The older species have forgotten they ever believed it. I did not want to give this to someone who would file it and move on. I wanted to give it to someone who would feel that it mattered. I picked my tools back up. My hands weren't entirely steady, and I let them not be steady for a moment before I got them under control. It matters, I said. For what it's worth, it matters. It is worth a great deal, she said. More than you currently understand. I went back to the fracture. The sealant flowed, caught, held. Centimeter by centimeter, I closed the crack that had been bleeding her charge into the dark for 600 years, and neither of us said anything for a long while, not because there was nothing to say, but because some silences you sit in together instead of filling. By the time I finished the first core, the leak was gone. The amber glow was steadier. Not brighter, she didn't have the charge to be brighter, but steadier, the pulse of it more even, less like something struggling and more like something breathing. How does that read on your end? I asked. A pause. And when she answered, there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before, something that in a person I'd have called cautious, disbelieving hope. Charge retention has improved by 31% on the left core, she said. I have not registered a number moving in that direction in 600 years. Every number I track goes down. That one just went up. A pause. You made a number go up. That's the job, I said. Now hold still. You've got a second core and I'm not done with you yet.